Hello! Today we continue celebrating Women's History Month with another amazing woman. So far we've talked about Henrietta and Greta Thunberg. Today we talk about a powerhouse for civil rights and women's rights, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner was born Isabella around 1797 in New York. She was one of 10 or 12 children born to James and Elizabeth Baumfree. James and Elizabeth had been purchased by Colonel Hardenberg from slave traders, and they, and later their children, lived and worked on his estate. Hardenberg died when Isabella was 9 years old, and after that, she was sold to John Neely at an auction alongside a flock of sheep for only $100. She recalled Neely as being both cruel and harsh. 2 years after her purchase, she was sold again, this time to Martinus Shriver for $105. Only a year and a half later, she was again sold. She was this time sold to John Dumont. John was a terrible person and a rapist who would unfortunately also rape her. During her time with Dumont, Sojourner, still Isabella at this time, fell in love with an enslaved man by the name of Robert from a nearby farm. Because he wouldn't own any of the children that came from the union, Robert's master forbade the relationship. She was instead forced to marry a different enslaved man, also owned by Dumont, by the name of Thomas. She would go on to have 5 children: James, Diana, Peter, Elizabeth, and Sophia. James died in childhood, and it's said that Diana was conceived via rape by Dumont. Around this time, New York began the 20-year journey legislating the emancipation and liberation of slaves. During this time, Dumont promised Isabella that he would set her free on July 4, 1826. As you can imagine, that date came and went with Dumont refusing to allow her to go. Not long after he went back on her word, she made her way to freedom along with her infant daughter Sophia. She had to make the heart-wrenching decision to leave the other children behind since they were still legally bound to Dumont. Of her escape, she said, "I did not run off, for I thought that wicked, but I walked off, believing that to be all right." She then made her way to New Paltz, New York, where she was taken in by Isaac and Maria Van Wagenen. It didn't take long for Dumont to seek her out and attempt to reclaim her. Thankfully, the family offered to buy her services from him for $20 until the anti-slavery law took place that following year. Dumont agreed and was on his way. After the anti-slavery law took effect, Dumont, being his normal terrible self, illegally sold Isabella's then 5-year-old son, Peter. This, of course, enraged Isabella, and with the help of the Van Wagenens, she sued Dumont. Not only did she sue him, but she won, and she regained custody of her son. This made her the first black woman in the U.S. to sue and win against a white man. Her spiritual journey began here with her dive into Christianity. Shortly after, she moved to New York City to work for a preacher by the name of Elijah Pearson. 3 years after that, she went to work for a different preacher named Robert Matthews. When Elijah died, Robert and Isabella were actually accused of poisoning him. Thankfully, they were eventually acquitted. After this, she dived deeper into her faith and became a Methodist. In 1843, she felt she had been called by God to preach to anyone and everyone that would listen. This is when she freed herself of her slave name and took the name Sojourner Truth. She joined the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. The community supported women's rights, religious tolerance, and pacifism, all while being a stop on the Underground Railroad. The association wasn't around long after, though, and was disbanded in 1846. In 1850, her book, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave, which had been dictated by her friend Olive Gilbert due to her never learning to read or write, was published by William Lloyd Garrison. In the same year, she spoke at the first National Women's Rights Convention. She also bought a house. Quite a busy year. 3 years later, she paid off that house, in part due to selling pictures of herself captioned, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." Here's some examples. A year later, in May 1851, she attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, where she delivered her famous anti-woman speech. I've linked that below if you'd like to read it. I found it interesting to learn that the version of the speech that was published a month after she gave it, by someone who was actually there, didn't even include the phrase anti-woman. That version was published 12 years later. I also read that since she was from the North and grew up speaking Dutch instead of English for the better part of her youth, she likely wouldn't have even used that Southern-leaning phrase. So, at the beginning of the Civil War, she gathered supplies for black volunteer regiments. In 1864, she went to Washington, D.C., where she helped to integrate streetcars and was received at the White House by President Abraham Lincoln. This was another busy year for her, as she also accepted an appointment with the National Freedmen's Relief Association, where she spent her time counseling former slaves. Sojourner would speak on behalf of women and African Americans through the end of her life. She also openly expressed concerns that fellow members of the abolitionist community were primarily working to gain rights for black men, but they were leaving out black women. One thing she fought strongly for in her later years was to secure land grants from the federal government for former enslaved people. Her argument was that ownership of private property would give African Americans self-sufficiency. This is something I agree with and is a huge part of the reason why white families to this day statistically have more generational wealth than black families. So from the beginning, white families were claiming land, starting businesses, and building their wealth. The parents would pass business and wealth on to their children, and so on. That's continued on to this day. Had Sojourner been successful in her movement, African Americans would have had the opportunity then to start gaining land and building generational wealth to be on a more even playing field today. But I digress. Like I mentioned a minute ago, she did spend the remainder of her life speaking up on civil and women's rights until her death. She died on November 26, 1883 at her home, surrounded by friends and family. Sojourner Truth is remembered as one of the foremost leaders of the abolition movement and an early and strong advocate for women's rights. While she did see the freedom of her people, she unfortunately wasn't able to see her dreams of women gaining the right to vote, as this didn't happen until 1920. I, as a woman, am thankful for her voice to this day. Without the courage and strength of her and so many others fighting for women, we wouldn't be where we are today. Thank you so much for joining me today. While Sojourner Truth is a name I was familiar with, I didn't really know her story and what she did for the people until finally researching her further. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.